Hello and welcome to another episode of Construction Corner Podcast. I'm Dylan. I'm your host, and today I'm going to be recapping the RE Plus conference that I attended this last week in Anaheim, California, and what it's all about. Again, Dillon Mitchell, electrical engineer specializing in commercial construction, and this year I will eclipse $1 billion in projects that I've directly had a hand in, whether it's been projects in my early career that I designed or later on as I grew, became a licensed engineer and actually signed and sealed those construction documents for the electrical systems for those projects. So decade plus of experience, ton of experience doing these projects, and I have learned a lot over the years. And the whole reason I do this podcast is to share the lessons I've learned along the way, whether that's in specifically electrical engineering, project management, hiring people, firing people, working with other trades and disciplines, architects, engineers, contractors, you name it. That's what this show is all about. And today, I'm just going to recap the conference, some takeaways that I had from it, and the lessons that I kind of learned and grabbed away from conferences. So, if you haven't been to some conferences in the past or really aren't familiar with just conference or trade shows in general, pretty much the way that these work are they're in big convention centers, and each company that goes there to attend has a booth anywhere from a like 10 by 10 space to I think the biggest ones here were like 40 by 40. So fairly big footprints for the biggest booths um, at this particular conference. And so walking the kind of trade show floor, you have tons of companies. I think there were in the thousands of companies that were in attendance there and exhibiting. You also have speakers and these little, whether they're roundtables or just speakers talking about the industry, what's going on. For this one in particular, RE Plus is a renewable energy conference. So, a ton of solar. There wasn't any wind, no hydro, and then batteries was the kind of other side of this. So everything to do with solar in the panels themselves, the hardware to install them on a roof or ground. So for utility sales stuff where they're put them on just in dirt, and then you have the arrays out in a field, basically. The inverters for them, transformers, all the utility grade distribution systems that go along with it were there. There were some engineering firms there. So you kind of had the gamut on that side of it, but solar and then batteries. So there was a ton of battery systems and companies, all the, again, more utility scale stuff for this, but basically a system where you'd have a um, container, right, of like a 50-foot container full of batteries, and the doors would come, you'd swing out to have all your battery stacks and everything in there for the renewables. So makes it pretty easy to set on a site. You just have a container unit that you would set and plug it in, and you're pretty much ready to go. So that's how a lot of the battery systems were there. But you had Samsung and other manufacturers for it, and then you had other pretty much all manufacturers for it, engineering companies, and then some other services along that. So that's what this was. It was massive. It was at the Anaheim Convention Center, which is right next to Disney, and just covered a huge breadth of area. And some of these booths are pretty crazy. So, the one first thing, okay, so that's how the conference was laid out. Then, really walking around the show floor again, thousands, 1,500, maybe 2,000 vendors, companies that were there. Really, from my perspective, you had a ton of companies there, but really only a few key manufacturers. Then everything else was kind of a derivative thereof. Um, that's just, again, my take on it. You had a few kind of primary key manufacturers, and then everything else was kind of second tier. There was so that's on like solar panels. Then you had a couple key like manufacturers of the mechanical systems that support the panels, right? All the racking or the rails or the ground screws that go into the ground for any of the field and really utility scale stuff. So you had all those, and then all the companies that also did um, roof mounts for residential. And that was kind of the other split. There was a lot of residential there because this conference, again, applied to a lot of electrical contractors, is a lot of the attendees. And in that, you had a lot of installers, and a lot of those guys are primarily in the residential business, not necessarily on the commercial or utility scale side of things. So with that, you had, a lot of companies and how they mounted roofs, that kind of stuff. And then on the other side of it, you had, again, just a handful of companies that did kind of utility scale projects. With that, the thing in booths, and I really just found this to be fascinating. This is kind of just the marketing business owner side of me, is how do you end up showing ROI on having a booth of that scale, that magnitude at a conference like this? So if you haven't been to any of these booths are super elaborate. They have just massive displays. They're bringing in equipment a lot of the time. So for like, there's a manufacturer, Vermeer, which does, I mean, they do a lot of like ditch digging equipment and things like that, or pile drivers and other equipment. And that's like a $500,000 piece of equipment. So, and they had two of them there. So you got $1 million piece of equipment in your booth. Granted, you're the manufacturer, but still transportation costs to get it all there, set it up, the time to do all that. Other of these booths are pretty elaborate in that they have uh, two levels with like meeting rooms on top. It's a whole kind of construction project in of itself to get these booths set up with tables and chairs and everything else that goes into these. Again, 20 by 20 or 30 by 30 or 40 by 20 or whatever their space ends up being. But I mean, just these massive kind of display booths and representations for all their goods and services. So pretty kind of extensive thing, display boards, video boards. So the booth in and of itself could be 30, 50, 100 grand. And then the space that they rent for the 3, 4 days at the conference is also, probably on the cheap end. For a 10 by 10 is maybe 5 grand. And then some of these big booths are 50 or $100,000, and that doesn't even include like sponsorship or sponsoring the lanyards or Wi-Fi or all the other sponsorship opportunities that the conference provides people to invest in. So for some of these large booths, I mean, you're talking just in the booth, construction plus the space. I mean, you might be at 200 grand before you ever open the conference. And then a lot of these bigger companies are also sending, 10, 20, 30 plus people to the show, and you have 2 grand a day pretty conservatively, $1,000 in labor, $1,000 in hotel and food and whatever else, kind of just transportation costs. So then you're looking at, 2 grand a day on the low end for these guys. And if you send, 20, 30 people, you could start to see how this adds up pretty quick. So you're looking at trying to have a return on investment for 200, 400, $500,000 for this one show. Now, in doing this, if you have 20 guys and you have all of them have meetings with clients or clients on the books or prospective clients on the books prior to ever being at the show, right? They're going to meet at the show, and you have 20 meetings scheduled pretty quickly, especially for some of these big companies. The ROI is there. It comes back pretty quickly. It can really justify itself. So for a lot of folks, I think in these conferences and going to them and how we do this kind of stuff is making sure that you have meetings set, that you're going and talking to vendors, that you have all of these kind of outlined before you ever show up to a conference. And by doing that, it will then pay for itself. a lot of people go to these and kind of wing it. They don't have meetings outlined. They're don't plan on going to the bar for at whatever hotel the conference is next to or close to. And you really kind of squander a lot of opportunities because really it's not at the show floor going and talking to vendors or whoever you happen to run into. But it is done at the bar. It's done at these meeting rooms. It's done at the after parties that are pre-planned. So going into conferences, you need to have a little more planning done and who you're meeting, who you're um, doing business with, and that will go a long way to really helping you move your company down the field and getting more projects um, on basically on your plate and winning more projects, having more partners. And that's how that ends up getting won. So as a small company, you might not be able to exhibit, but if you, again, go have a bunch of these meetings planned, you know who you're going to talk to, want to talk to, that goes a really long way to making these shows pay for themselves instead of you having to shell out, $500,000 before you go to any of these. So that's one. Again, a lot of money is just spent on flash and show. But again, if you have the substance, if you have the meetings, that's super beneficial. And then the third big takeaway is for this conference in particular, I want to make this point in that separating why people were there versus the theme of the conference. So it was all about renewable energy, really solar panels, solar installation, how to put these systems in, the materials that you can use to do a faster, easier, better job in installing, right? From steel that you're using, high tensile strength stuff, ground screws for all the utility scale stuff, roof mounting systems, ballasted systems to basically hold the panels down so they don't fly away in high wind situations. Transformers, inverters, generators, like battery systems, all this kind of stuff was there. So when it comes down to it, all this was done for the electrical contractor at the end of the day who's installing these projects. It was all about making their life easier, their life better, so that they make more money on these projects at the end of the day. There's a lot of them out there. A lot of these projects are out there. So they don't necessarily care about renewables or green or any of that, other than there's a lot of work in the solar space. And so it's all about them making more money effectively at the end of the day on their projects. And I think that gets misconstrued maybe a little bit in that there's a lot of people attending this, but because there's a lot of work, but again, only a few select people are going to drive this, right? At utility scale, it's again mandated on the government side. There's a lot of incentives for it. So people are going to install it in land that they have available to put these systems in. So it's not necessarily that a guy installing the system or bidding on these projects believes in it. It's a way for them to feed their families. And so I think we need to, again, take that into account because at the end of the day, like in the renewable systems, like hydro is not taken into account as a renewable energy source, right? So we have snowmelt, it rains, right? That does renew. For solar panels in 20 years, that panel needs to be replaced, right? What are you going to do with the old ones? And when you drive out to Palm Springs from LA, like there's just miles of windmills that are 20, 30 years old that are rusting out in the middle of the desert. What are you going to do with those, right? Windmill blades need to be replaced. Have you ever seen a ceiling fan that's been there for 10 years, right? The blades are a little droopy that are outside. So I think we forget that in these systems, especially solar and wind, you've got to replace the entirety of the system that captures energy. Batteries are no different. In 10 years, that reaches the end of the life of the battery and they need to be replaced. It doesn't necessarily renew. There's still maintenance that goes on in water systems, and hydros and dams, the turbine blades need to be replaced and maintained over time. And that is also super important. So I think when it comes to renewables, especially, like we've got to be pretty, um, we got to separate why people do the projects versus their beliefs around the energy usage of those systems. Wind is a very big problem for utilities. It's basically why you need battery storage. Um, and then we think about the mining and everything else that goes into creating batteries to store energy. So, again, I do want to bring up that point that while there was a lot of people there, it's really not their belief system around renewables or that they believe in this system more than anything else. It's just that there are a lot of projects and opportunities, and they're not about to leave money on the table so that they can feed their families at the end of the day, right? That's what this is about doing projects better, easier, faster, so that they're able to, again, make money, feed their family, and provide to their communities. So let's not forget that. And one thing that I do want to throw in here is, and just give you this idea, is what do plants ultimately need to survive? They need sunlight, water, air, but that air needs to be primarily carbon dioxide. That's what plants use to uh, do photosynthesis, and then they give off oxygen, right? So if you remember back to like sixth grade biology class, that plants plants and humans kind of are a symbiotic relationship, that we exhale carbon dioxide, the plants use it to do photosynthesis, and then they give off oxygen, which then we breathe in, right? We still breathe a lot of CO2 in our air, but oxygen, nitrogen, that's all part of the air mix that we end up breathing. And then again, we exhale mostly CO2, and then the plants use that for photosynthesis. So in a CO2 low environment, plant life doesn't thrive as well. So the more CO2 that there is for plants, the better the plants do, which means more oxygen that they give off. So something to think about and consider when you start talking about some of these environmental items and what that means. But ultimately, the RE Plus conference was kind of neat to go to. Again, conferences, when you go to them, make sure that you have a plan to go, who you're going to meet, visit, so that that conference is ultimately worth it. And you're not just going into, um, walk the show floor and see what's new. I mean, there is a time and a place for that. But as far as conferences go, make sure that you have a plan or know what you're going to get out of it. And some conferences are purely for learning, right? You're going there to hear all the speakers, see what's new, and then bring those things back to your company so that you can implement the new ideas, see what's new out there, and really for your benefit. But have a plan when you go to these conferences, and it'll do you a tremendous amount of good um, for you, for your company, and again, make sure that it's ROI positive, because at the end of the day, all this stuff has to get paid for. So make sure that you're being successful and using your money and time wisely. So without further ado, that's going to be this episode of the Construction Corner podcast. And until next time, don't forget to share the show.